Okay, welcome everyone to our fifth and final session of our second webinar series, Building a Resilient Food Culture. My name is Adam Morgan. I'm the Advocacy Coordinator for Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank. Today, we will be talking about the relationship between the food system and racial justice and undoing those injustices in order to move towards a more equitable and inclusive food system. Just a reminder that today's webinar is scheduled to go until 1:30, not the usual 1 o'clock, and that the webinar today is being recorded and we sent out to all registrants in the coming days. If you'd like to watch any of the previous sessions, you can find them on Food 21's website under resources. We will share the link later today. Feel free to submit questions and comments throughout the session, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. And we have sent out the full bios of all of our speakers today, but I'll briefly introduce them and then we'll get started. Today's session will be moderated by first, Dr. Audrey Morell, Professor of Business Administration, Psychology, Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh School of Business. She is also currently the board chair of Food 21. Previously, she served as the acting dean of the University of Pittsburgh's Honors College. And the second moderator is Godfrey Bethea Jr., Vice President of Equity, People, and Culture for Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank. Godfrey has over 15 years as a certified diversity and human resources leader, previously with FedEx Ground, Gateway Health, and 84 Lumber. Today's panelists will include Illinois State Representative Sonia Harper, representing the 6th District in Chicago since 2015. She is the chairperson of the Agriculture and Conservation Committee, the first Black member to serve in that capacity, and has recently been appointed as chairperson of the Agriculture Committee for the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Next, we have Dr. Diamante Walker, Deputy Executive Director of the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Pittsburgh. She is also the executive director of the Pittsburgh Land Bank. Dr. Walker is an alumnus of the Advanced Leadership Institute and was recently awarded the Black Excellence in Real Estate Award by Catapult Pittsburgh. Finally, Tacumba Turner is the Farm and Education Manager for Oasis Farm and Fishery, where his work in the Homewood community is to utilize the Oasis Bioshelter and Gardens as a medium to cultivate well-being. Tacumba previously served as a crew member in his high school Student Conservation Association and then studied at the Bidwell Training Center's Horticulture Technology Program. Thank you all so much for being here today. I will turn it over to Audrey and Godfrey, and I will stop sharing my screen.
I'm so excited. I've been waiting for this event and to have this important conversation. It really is a great way to be able to really tie a bow around the collaboration between Food 21 and the Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank. And I'm so pleased to have Godfrey here to help me as my partner in crime to do a little traffic control as we get into some good trouble in terms of talking about this whole conversation about food and racial equality. So Godfrey, you know, if you want to make some opening remarks, and then we can start having our panelists just to give some opening perspective as we dive into the questions.
Thank you. As I'm as well excited to join today, I want to give a little overview of my role here with the food bank. And in my position as Vice President of Equity, People, and Culture, it is important for my role to manage the human resource functions and all the people management, in addition to cultivating an inclusive working environment at the Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank. The overall goal is to lead and align staff to the food bank's mission to feed people in need and mobilize our community to eliminate hunger. Eliminating hunger is a community initiative, and our equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI for short, initiatives commit to represent and support the communities in which we live and serve. To do this, our journey at the food bank begins with a common understanding of the true opportunities of our organization, our organizational focus of diversity, inclusion, and most importantly, equity and how it plays into internally to our organization and externally, putting an equity lens to racial and social justice issues. This foundational approach is imperative to ensure our goals align, the terms of which we speak about diversity and inclusion all have the same meaning, and that we are all brought into the vision of equality and justice for all. The food bank has 3 ED&I strategic pillars: workforce, workplace, and community. The workforce focuses on attracting, optimizing, and advancing our employees. The workforce focuses on enhancing our culture through EDI cultural learning, knowledge sharing, and engagement, and the community is focusing on servicing and partnering and supporting individuals, network partners, and suppliers in our servicing area. All of the food bank's EDI initiatives will center around these 3 areas: workforce, workplace, and culture. At the food bank, it is important that we create the environment where the diversity and uniqueness of our workforce are welcomed and able to thrive. This acceptance of diversity breeds innovation, diversity of thought, more connection and understanding of the needs of our community, especially with the importance of our historically marginalized community. This is the realization that we come from and are the community, but fully utilizing the voices of our staff is in every functional area of the food bank will help us continue providing charitable services, but also become part of the solution to eradicating and eliminating social inequalities that result in families' ability to have consistent, healthy, quality food choice sources. My goal is in the food bank is to be equipped with necessary sensitive mindset of cultural competence to be an effective advocate for not only charitable community actions and life sustainability measures, but for true connection to equitable root causes to understand the true knowledge and efforts needed in areas of quality housing, fair employment practices, and impacts of healthcare disparities. To do this, we use our workforce culture committee to regularly plan and organize monthly cultural learning opportunities centered around national cultural observances recognized by federal government. These programs create opportunities to educate staff and engage in internal dialogue with cultural knowledge sharing. Staff are able to share their experiences, perspectives from their unique cultural background, and this learning and appreciation of one another's cultural background gives opportunity to understand the unique perspectives and experience of our colleagues. In addition, I've introduced the Equity Council to be a strategic sounding board for equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. This council has a representation of each functional area of our organization and includes a balanced leadership from middle management to staff. This council the goal is to align EDI strategic focus, which applies the racial equity social lens with all day-to-day operations, and the food bank, which impacts our focus on the needs of the community, whether it's hunger, food insecurity, nutritional deficiencies, resource segregation, disabilities in health, disparities in health, as well as other social determinants. As we are sure to talk about in today's session, we'll be sure to discuss the interconnected need to look at holistically at the systems that affect the person's or family's ability to survive and thrive. This calls for increased attention to communities that have historically been left behind, some of whom have high rates of hunger and malnutrition. Communities impacted by hunger, by higher rates of food insecurity and hunger are largely because of structural institutional inequalities. And the food bank's acknowledgement of these efforts to reduce food insecurity and hunger is about putting the communities in the center through a racial and equity lens. With that, I am going to pass it on to our state representative, Sonia Harper.
Let me jump in before you do that, so there's a couple of things that you said in there that I want to really make sure we stick a pin in.
All right.
Right, because I think it's really important, and it's about true connections. I think that's a really critical point that you made there, that we want to make sure that we keep right in front of us, and true knowledge, right? And that resonates as well, and then true impact, right? So we really want to make sure, as we're talking about that, I heard that very much in the core of what you were saying. And so I think true connections, true knowledge, true impact are some of what we should really hold on to as we continue the conversation. And so we'll let Representative Harper jump in and just give the perspective, and then go with Dr. Walker and then Mr. Turner. And as you're talking, it'd be really good to share your perspective on what you think we get right and what do you think we get wrong. in this space. And again, I like that true connections, true knowledge, true impact that you said in the perspective of the food bank. So no, thanks for that. Representative Harper. Yeah, again, we were saying earlier today that all smart people are affiliated with the city of Chicago, which is my hometown. And so, send me some Garrett's popcorn after this and we'll be okay.
Yes, I sure will. And good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here with such wonderful food justice advocates and people doing wonderful work in the field. So again, thank you for having me today. As stated, I'm the first Black chairman of agriculture in the state of Illinois. I also chair our legislative Black caucus. And for the past 7 years now that I've been in the General Assembly, I've kind of been leading this charge for food equity, for food justice. Where it comes from is it comes from me growing up on the south side of Chicago. I live in a food desert, right? I live in a place where a lot of my colleagues couldn't believe it, and they would laugh at me when I was trying to pass bills down in session that we have hundreds of thousands of people living without access to healthy foods. And what type of impact is that having on us as a community and as our health? Well, my personal testimony is that at the age of 33, I became the eldest person in my family. Everyone in my family dying prematurely from preventable diet-related diseases in their late 30s and early 40s. And when I look around at the scope of our communities and I look at the south and west sides of Chicago and other areas across the state and other places across the nation where Black communities persist, there are also food deserts, right? And so basically a lot of my work has been trying to remedy that, trying to empower the people in those communities to take food access in their own hands in whatever way that looks like. So what that looked like in Chicago is using the enormous amount of vacant land that we have on the south and west sides that nobody's doing with, putting that land back to productive use, opening up urban farms and more community gardens, and also teaching people about healthy living. We're so removed from having good and healthful selections in our grocery stores that our demand in our communities has weakened for healthy fruits and vegetables. And again, when you think about the impact that this has overall on our public health in these same communities that may not have good access to healthcare, in these same communities where their education funding is being attacked on a daily basis, not only do you have to deal with food, but you're also dealing with these other social determinants of health and these other issues that are impacted. So food is at the center of just gaining equity on all things in our community. And I'm gonna stop there. I could add that I even came to the legislature by organizing in my community, starting an organization called Grow Greater Englewood, where our #1 mission was to develop our vacant land, train farmers to get on that land, ease any restrictions or barriers to getting on land, but also educating the public. We need jobs in our community, right? And all the things that we need, we could also meet. If we need food, if we need jobs, how do we use our own land as a resource to do that? How do we use our vacant spaces and our vacant buildings to do that? And so that's what a lot of the work that I've been doing in the General Assembly is around, helping to provide incentives for that, helping to even define what urban agriculture is, what farmer equity is, so that once we define these elements, we can then now put funding towards the solution for a lot of those elements. And so I'm just going to stop there, and I look forward to our conversation today as we talk about equity in all things and building a local healthy food system, which is mostly important for our communities.
No, I think you really nailed it with equity in all things. And we tend to talk about food just in terms of access in grocery stores, but it's much more complicated when you talk about farmer equity, when you start talking about land use equity, when you talk about workforce, business development. All of those systems have to really come together with food at the center in order to be able to find the solutions, back to what Godfrey was saying, true knowledge, true impact. You can't have true impact if you're looking at these things in isolation. It's an amazing point. Thank you. And I grew up in Englewood, so.
Hey, neighbor.
Walker.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have to tell you that I'm kind of fangirling here with Representative Harper and Dr. Morrell, so bear with me. But I want to thank you for having me on the call today. I mean, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Representative Harper, you talked about land and the intersection of land and food policy and how we need to be a lot more thoughtful about how we're investing in that space. And so I am, for formal introduction, as was said earlier, I'm Dr. Diamante Walker, and I am the Deputy Executive Director of the Urban Redevelopment Authority. I am the first Black female director in the URA 75-year history. And I don't lead with that to say, for self-aggrandizement. I say that it's taken way too long. And there were certainly, Black women before me and people of color before me who were worthy of that space. But I think the thing that makes me unique is that I come from a food desert. I currently live in a neighborhood that is without a grocery store or access to fresh food. And so, I certainly have a certain amount of privilege where I can get in my fancy car and drive across a bridge and, procure whatever food I want from Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, wherever. But I wake up every day and I think about the people who are not afforded such a privilege in this community. And so the work that I try to do at the URA is to be mindful of that food is such a basic necessity. And there are people who have to spend more time worrying about where their next meal is coming from, whether or not they can give their kids apples and carrots, or if they're going to have to pick between medicine and ramen noodles. And that is a travesty. And we can and we must do better than that as a system. And so a little bit about the URA. The URA is the City of Pittsburgh's economic development agency. We work to support the economic development goals that are established by the city, which is designed to create inclusive opportunity for residents, stakeholders, and communities. That's a very fancy way of saying our mission used to be about place. Today, our mission is squarely about people and how people are transforming while we are investing in place. And so the North Star for how we do that work is we remind ourselves to remain committed to creating housing that is affordable to the average Pittsburgher, encouraging more entrepreneurship and small business development, particularly in our low to moderate income Black communities and communities of color, promoting inclusive growth and quality job creation. We need a city that is growing, but smart growth means that everybody's growing at the same pace and nobody's being left behind, that we are expanding our reach into neighborhoods in Main Street revitalization efforts. People live around the block, right? Not everybody has a car. Not everybody is going to want to get on a bike. And so we have to ensure that folks have critical services and access to critical opportunities within their neighborhood. And then the last thing that we focus on, but certainly not the least, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, is creating a talented workforce that is equipped with the skills of the future. And so one thing that I'd like to unpack before I turn it back over to you, Dr. Morrell, is one of the ways that we've decided to do this is to focus on an initiative that we call Avenues of Hope. And so we invest a lot of money at the URA, but it's not been very strategic. It's not been always been intentional or really focused on the folks that need it the most and deserve it the most. And so we did some soul searching at the onset of the pandemic to say, why do we exist and who do we exist for? And the market will take care of itself, right? Like the market will figure it out. That is what the free market does. What about folks where the market has been an instrument of harm in neighborhoods? How can the public sector be an instrument for good and for equity and for inclusion? So the Avenues of Hope is an initiative that was designed to be place-based, but people first. And it's an intervention that cuts across all layers of life: health and wellness, sustainable Main Street development, business growth and development, and supporting the inclusive growth of neighborhoods. And so we are focusing on the preservation of culture in neighborhood. Food is at the intersection of culture. Making sure that folks, when they're in their neighborhood and the neighborhood is changing, that the neighborhood looks more like them than less like them, and making sure that these communities are supported through education, healthcare, recreation, human supportive services, and access to fresh food. So thank you again for having me this afternoon, and I'm going to pause there to open it up for questions.
That's amazing, that focusing not just on place, but on people, that contrast, because the other thing that we sometimes do, and it's something we should talk about after we let Mr. Turner give his introductory remarks, is that we sometimes blame people for place.
Absolutely.
And,
We
and so the
absolutely
fact
do
that you're
that.
looking at them together and the intersection is it's absolutely spot on. So we should make sure we dial back to have more conversation about that.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Mr. Turner.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? So I want to kind of piggyback off of something Ms. Harper was saying around, you know, at least what I took from it was like her articulating like what an asset-based approach looks like when it comes to the work and trying to get people involved and like thinking about the assets that we currently have access to or control over and how those could be used to push, you know, much of what needs to happen forward. And I think, you know, in the context of my work, that's certainly the case. And looking at, you know, the fact that we've inherited a disrepaired relationship with food and the land subsequently. And through that, we now are in a situation where we really look at building relationships as central to all of this work. We don't want to come around and like, you know, finger wagging and kind of acting in a judgmental way. So I feel very strongly about that. And I think that's something we're trying to emulate here in Homewood. But beyond that, I do think I'm kind of going to bounce around here, but I do think like the lens of like farming agribusiness as like a traditional business is a non-starter, just in terms of like the equity piece and like the things that are entailed with an agribusiness, you know, from labor. A lot of farms rely on immigrant labor. That's because they, you know, variances in pays and labor. And I think, you know, that's something that has to be considered, as well as like, what does it look like to kind of try to foster a cooperative ecosystem of businesses where the model of business looks a little different. Because certainly, you know, if you can consider something like in 1862, the Homestead Act, David Freeman was the first person to take that up. You know, he was able to secure 160 acres. We kind of fast forward from then to now, where less than 1% of all farmers are Black, right? I'm not really sure what the land ownership rates are, but you know, I think there's a lot of deliberate policy decisions that were necessary to create middle class, working white middle classes at the expense of Black land ownership. So I feel like that's a tension that I don't know can be totally reconciled by just trying to duplicate what's worked for other people. I do think there's some careful considerations that have to kind of happen for the community well-being to really be centered. So as like communities are being revitalized, social sustainability, for instance, is something that's prioritized. So the people that currently live in a place like Homewood that's being gentrified benefit from all of the changes, all of the farms that are popping up that may drive property prices up. So yeah, I'm just saying that to say, I think, you know, having an asset-based approach in spite of all of the deliberate policy decisions is a necessity as far as like what's going to help mobilize Black and Brown communities, and particularly to try to kind of forge different coalitions around the land and try to take advantage of programs through the URA or other state or federal programs that could be leveraged to deprivatize land or put it into better purposes that meet immediate needs and, you know, long term. So.
No, and I think, you know, that notion of cooperative ecosystems, whether it be their business, public-private partnerships and the like, is really something we should make sure that we don't lose as part of this conversation. And at Food 21, we talk about resilient ecosystems, which I think if there's one thing that we know coming out of, well, sort of coming out of the COVID pandemic, is that issues that we've seen weren't created by the pandemic. They were just put on the front page and made worse. And so all the things that we're seeing as a result of that are really things that we haven't been able to resolve because we don't have a resilient food ecosystem. I don't know, Godfrey, they gave us a lot of stuff. Where do you want to start? I know we got some questions that people sent in before. Where do you want to start? I'm handing the ball to you because I have a page full of notes. So where do you think we should dig in first?
As do I. This is and I saw some common themes and kind of what was being discussed, you know, from State Representative Sonia Harper talking about empowering the community, Dr. Walker talking about, having that lived experiences, but also, bringing that, transforming that knowledge into, uplifting the community and bringing resources back to the community, bring that education. So talking about that true knowledge that we talked about earlier, of the community and impact and the need. And then Takamba really kind of, bringing it full circle when you're talking about, farming as a business, modeling the business itself, and understanding how to create them, bring those resources, driving those resources back to the community, taking that ownership.
Right.
So I don't know where to start. That's we can start there, dive there, and anybody wants to talk deeper into that aspect of bringing and driving those resources back to the community.
Yeah, it sounds like of the list that I like the way you pulled those things from each of the intros. And one of we talk about this a lot with our students, what's the little red thread, right? And one of those little red threads is the recognition and maybe the leveraging. I'm going back to this notion of asset focus, of food as an economic driver. And what does that mean? So if we define food as an economic driver, and there's certain communities that are left out of either the business of food, agriculture, then what does that mean? Does that help to prioritize things? I don't know. What does anybody think about that? Making a stake in the ground, food as an economic driver, so that if you have food systems in the community, you have those assets. If you don't, it really puts that notion, Godfrey, what you were talking about, all those disparities right on Front Street. Yeah, go ahead, Takamba. Mr. Turner, go ahead.
I think as a start, it's helpful to distinguish the notions of like a proximity-based kind of approach versus like a control orientation, and like how we can leverage assets.
Oh, you getting fancy on us now, right?
I mean, it's like,
I love it.
because we can't confuse like how do we get to this point? Right? We just look at the deficits that are here in a vacuum. That's going to lead us down a certain path that may not really be able to remedy, how we got to this kind of point. So I just feel like, kind of having that distinction and, looking at the ways we can reduce harm and provide people access to fresh produce in ways that address their immediate needs, but also looking at, to your point, like food as an economic driver, right? And if we were to take serious like the scale of produce that's needed to actually feed, and Pittsburgh is a much smaller city compared to, Chicago, but I think, even just in Homewood, to give everyone access to fresh produce for a year, right? Every day, we would need about 2.3 million pounds of produce. I got to that number. If you take what the USDA recommends, for instance, where they're recommending folks eat 2.5 cups of fresh vegetables. That's about a pound. And if you times that by the number of days in a year by 6,500, which is approximately the number of residents that live in Homewood, the Blackest neighborhood in Pittsburgh, that's what you have to do. So there's 6 farms in Homewood. There's no way we each could grow 345,000 pounds. Like, so it's just like the scale, but it's an opportunity there. But if it's just like, hey, we just need commercial retailers to come in, and maybe there's a couple low entry jobs that are able to be secured that don't pay a living wage necessarily, don't offer a chance to have equity or ownership. That's really, it's a Band-Aid approach. And I just feel like we're in a spot now where we don't need any more Band-Aids. So I just feel like, that's all. So I just like really considering like taking stock of the scale of the issue and like, really thinking about how control and leveraging models of economic development that encourage the type of equity that we aim to kind of strive for could converge in different ways. So
yeah, and Carlos put in the chat about public-private partnerships, and that sounds, not only some of what you're hinting at, but I see Dr. Walker's hand up, and that's right on the block where you live and work and really hope to be able to move. So why don't you weigh in here too?
When you talk about food as an economic driver, I mean, we're talking fundamentally about supply and demand. We know that we have a demand in our neighborhoods and a need in our neighborhoods for food and quality food. We know, as you know, Takumba said, that we cannot meet the demand based on the way that things are structured right now. So our local farmers and local agriculturalists are not able to scale to meet the need. But one of the things that I've seen in my practice is that I think that we forget that even though food is a consumable and it's an essential thing, there are a lot of regulations around food, which have led to the impediments and the barriers that keep folks from creating food-based businesses. You have to cook in a commercial kitchen. If you want to, if you want to take a city-owned or a public-owned parcel to grow food, you have to have the soil test. There are all these economic barriers that disempower folks from being able to use food as a way of, not even just for commercialization or proliferation, just to meet basic needs in communities. And so as we look at the creation of cooperative models, and I am not the subject matter expert on this, there are probably folks in the participant queue that could talk a lot better about this than I can, but I think that we know that it's going to be a multi-pronged strategy, and we have to start to reduce barriers and rethink how regulations have also disempowered communities because they've structured these regulations the way that they need to exist in white communities. They don't fit in Black communities like Homewood, Hill District, and Hazelwood. So we need a big rethink on how we keep people safe, but how at the same time we empower the people on the front lines who could economically benefit from offering, some sort of fresh food access.
Well, as part of what you're talking about, one of the things we know from the research and we know from history, and when you start talking about public-private partnerships and regulations, as we're going straight at you, Representative Harper. We're coming your way with that, but that food is an anchor business. Food is well documented of all different types, and so to not have that access within a particular community is taking out one of the key anchor businesses that we know drives other businesses to locate in a particular community and provides that resilient economic ecosystem. Food is documented not only locally, but globally to be able to do that. And so food is an anchor business. It is in and of itself. You don't do anything to it for it to be an economic driver. So when it's absent, you're missing an anchor in a particular community. What do you think about that, Representative Harper? I see you smiling as people are talking. You like, you're singing my song.
It sounds like we all agree, food is an economic driver. Here in the state of Illinois, agriculture is our #1 industry. It is the state's top job producing industry. And where are we in it? Virtually nowhere, right? And that has dwindled over time, right? When you talk about how many Black producers there used to be, based on how many there are now, right? We used to have some foot in the game, and now none at all. I think that's when you talk about coming up with some innovative solutions and some innovative public-private partnerships that would help to turn this around. I've had conversations in my own state with organizations, businesses such as Instacart, right? And so now with this newfound appreciation for Black farmers or farmers of color, and this newfound appreciation because COVID has shed such a light on the inequities that we already knew existed. Now you have organizations wanting to partner in some way, but I'm having to tell them there needs to be another level of investment before farmers can even partner with a service such as Instacart, right? And you're talking about this ability to scale up. And that I kind of think is where we're stuck right now. There is plenty of opportunities out here. Are we armed to take advantage of them? Are we truly armed, even in this time when there's so much funding coming down from the federal government, when there's so much interest, again, from private industry to help? Are we going to be able to garner those resources in the right way, in the right types of long-term sustainable programs that will get us the long-term tangible benefits we need, and not just a small 6-month to a year program, urban farming pilot that you will see, popping up lots of times. I could even talk about the fact that we have so-called food justice organizations in the state who are receiving funding to provide the food boxes. And so then I go down to, we have a historic Black farming community called Pembroke Township in Illinois, which at one time, it produced all of the food that was needed for the Black folk on the southwest side of Chicago. And so now that they aren't right, it's no wonder that we're a food desert. But to get back to the story, our Black food justice organizations here in the city, instead of contracting with the local farmers here in Illinois, the local farmers of color, to provide for their food, for the food boxes, they went to a very well-known distributor that already exists here. And so we need to take hold of these opportunities where we can empower our own communities, but maybe it's just going to take a little bit more of a conversation and innovation, because quite frankly, we're at a point that we've never been at before.
Do you see a overhaul in some aspects of USDA, around food policy? Carlos sort of put that question in the chat as part of what is in this punch list of these are the top priorities. I mean, you sort of sit at those, in some of those conversations. Any thought about that?
So at the USDA level, I am seeing some movement. I'm not getting a lot of like tangible results, but the movement that I see is actually starting to have the conversation, starting to bring Black farmers into conversations with the White House about what help or repair looks like for our local food systems. I also kind of want to talk about, go back to how the economic driver is not necessarily about growing food per se, or having your hands in the dirt, or even cooking food, but there is something called a local healthy food system, and there are so many jobs and opportunities along it. It would behoove us to educate our communities about these different opportunities that exist and prepare them for these types of communities. You need everything in the farming industry, to soil, to seeds, to transportation, to irrigation and water, to marketing, to business consulting, to legal services, to everything. And those are the places where we need to be in our local healthy food system. And then I believe that we will see a better flow. But when you bring it back to even our cities and our places, where are we promoting this? Are our kids getting these lessons in school? Are our universities and our HBCUs leading people, to these types of careers? And are we really making the connections that we need to truly have a real mark in our own local healthy food system? Or will we be here singing this story in another 30 years? And so I think that when you talk about, definitely food is an economic driver, but how do we bring together the resources that we need, but also the education and the drive and the will and the want that will make those things come sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think that the whole thing about the supply chain that you mentioned, it's huge, right? We saw that. And and I know the food bank saw a lot of that, particularly during the pandemic. Godfrey, what were you going to jump in there with something?
Well, just in that education and getting that knowledge base to the younger generation. And Takamba, you're a perfect example of that. And that's one thing that I wanted to kind of drive in your bio. You went from getting that, just getting introduced to green education, and then going into different environments, and then coming back to this field. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what is that gravitated you towards that can help us understand what are the needs with the younger generation to get into this type of environment?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I want to say, early access exposure to it, just as like a vocation or a career path, it definitely helps to see people that look like you in it, which was definitely the case for me, having mentors. But also, in high school, usually folks have to do like research projects around career paths they may want to look into. And for me, I was encouraged to know, like, at that point in 10th grade, which is about 8-9 years ago, the green field, generally speaking, was set for growth. So this is 2012. So, I was encouraged by that. And to be honest with you, as things progressed, I got out of Bidwell and got working with GTEC, was doing vacant lot revitalization at the time. That's where I kind of got exposed to this idea of urban gardening, and you know, I don't come from a traditional farming background. My grandma grew a couple of plants here and there. I had some snake grass plants, but by no means did I grow up around people with green thumbs per se. So I feel like, you know, my passion for community and wanting to teach and help uplift and give back kind of was able to be manifested through the work I'm doing now, as far as just like a healthy outlet for it. And you know, I think as far as like me talking to students about agriculture as a vocation now, I'm very much so aware of like some of the challenges, and like just if you were to start your own farm, you know, there's a lot of consideration that to go into it. And I think, you know, in a lot of ways, people are at a disadvantage. So I feel like, you know, really thinking about where are those adjacent opportunities within that industry where you could take these skills and move into something else. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunities there, especially as hemp begins to get much more attention as far as how it can be used for, you know, bio uptake of to remediate toxins from lands, for instance, or make fibers from it, or of course, you know, the cannabinoids, you know, cannabis, you know, up to working in a greenhouse in a controlled environment, and or, you know, something else. So I feel like, you know, there's like the commercial piece, then there's like you want to teach, work at, you know, a Bidwell or a Chatham or whatever. So I think, you know, at this point, there are a lot of different things without even mentioning like the particular aspects of like bioengineering, for instance, which isn't agriculture per se, but, you know, people do forage and grow mushrooms. And there's a lot of different things you can do with like mycelium, for instance, which is the root of fungi that, you know, there are people trying to make leather out of mycelium. So I think there's a lot of ever evolving industries that if you go to a city school, you're not even gonna hear about unless you like listen to podcasts. But, you know what I mean? And then even then, you know, I just think, so I feel for me trying to kind of open people up to, hey, here's how you can take some of these core concepts and goes in all these different directions with. So I feel like, you know, if that happens to be an ag, all the better, but if not, you know, so because I'm thinking for myself, like I didn't foresee myself farming in 10th grade. So it just kind of, I had a couple of core things I really felt passionate about. And like when the opportunity presented itself, I took advantage of it. And I think, you know, having a sense of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to apply my skills really helped kind of provide that clarity. But, you know, I think, you know, trying to just, you know, articulate that, you know, there are a lot of different ways you could use horticulture to aid your community. So hopefully I answered the question. No, kind of.
Yeah, you know, I think we do food a disservice by how we talk about it as a profession and as an industry. We don't frame food correctly. You know, you know, to me, there's no way you can talk about biomed and not include food. One of the people put in the chat about biomed and high tech. And I could tell you for every one of those sectors that we talk about as being hot, biomed, high tech, and the like, food is actually central in them. When you look at processing, when you look at issues in terms of the interface between health and wellness and the ability of medicines to actually do what they need to do, food is at the center. And so for some reason, how we talk about food as an industry has not changed. Our vocabulary and how we communicate it has not changed. And so it seems like it's a dead industry and a dead track, but I think everybody who's been watching all those trucks sitting there with no drivers, and so you can't get the food, and everybody that's, you know, that's been mad about the chicken wing crisis, which I'm trying to figure out, you know, how come we're having a chicken leg and a chicken thigh crisis, because they all go together. But all of those things represent, you know, why not driverless trucks to be able to move the food, right? As opposed to driverless cars. There's something about how we're not talking about this that's not resonating with not just future generations. It's not resonating with current generations in terms of a workforce. I don't know, Godfrey, what do you think about that?
No, I agree. I think it's one of those things. It's when you're thinking about the field of study is one of those things that's fancy. It's one of those things that people look for, to do. And it's making it, like you said, if food is the center of all of that, it's really making those connections. We're really understanding how they can be involved. Just like Representative Harper was talking about, there's so many facets to this whole concept that you can be involved. There's just really opening your eyes and understanding of that to really tie in your aspirations, what you want to do, tied to what's available for you to do, career wise. But I also want to ask a question here, just based around just the growing numbers. So not only with the African American community, are we aware that of the growing number of Aboriginal American Indigenous people in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania? Are we aware of that group as well? If no, how are we prepared to engage with the population through inclusion, awareness, education of our Indigenous people? And I think this will go to Dr. Walker. Maybe some thoughts there.
I am not personally familiar with the Aboriginal community here in Pittsburgh. However, what I will say is that we keep land keeps coming up, right? Like you don't get food without land. And so when we think about Indigenous people, I think one of the things that we do a really awful job of is recognizing that, there was somebody here occupying this space before us, and they cultivated this land and put blood, sweat, tears, and legacy into this land. And now there are all of these impediments that keep them from doing what they are the originators of, which is, again, cultivating the land in such a way that it is fruitful for us. So I think that one of the things that part of it, COVID has really provided a lot. There's a lot of limitations, whereas I think that the privilege of physical proximity and being able to physically go out into communities and where people are, we took that for granted, right? Like we took that for granted a little over 24 months ago. And so now we're trying to connect with everybody over Zoom, and there's a digital divide. And so what I am thinking about when we have that privilege of proximity, again, I think that we've got to stop relying so much on tech and assuming that people have seen the Facebook posts and they've seen the Twitter feed, and we've got to get out there, put our feet on the ground and get out here and talk to these communities and connect with these communities and ensure that they know how to talk to us and keep those two-way lines of communication open. I'm seeing a lot about, land and justice. And Representative Harper said this, earlier about looking at all this underperforming land. Nobody knows what to do with it. It's not necessarily developable. How do we get beyond that programmatic intervention level to start creating structural opportunities to earmark land for the purpose of food, access, cultivation, and commerce? I mean, so the URA right now, we're working on a couple of initiatives that we believe will do that. We're working with Food 21 in at least, I think, 3 neighborhoods right now. I know Larimer and the Hill District, being 2 of them. But I think that those are the seedlings that begin to set the foundation for how we start to develop these models. And then, I want them to be open source. If we're doing something that's working, I think the way this gets done is other people latch onto it and they begin scaling. One of the biggest mistakes I think that we believe is that the system has this all figured out and the system is going to save us. It is not. It is not going to save us. We have to save us, and we have to apply that external and internal pressure to reform these systems so that so nobody feels like, why isn't my particular sector, my particular community a part of this conversation? That's hard work during a pandemic. That's not an excuse. We've got to do better, and the world will open up again. But I think we'll have a very renewed and fresh perspective about how we ensure that not only are we inviting people to the table, but that they are actually the curators of the menu so that we get it right.
There's a group that I work with, and we have a saying, either you're at the table or you're on the menu, right? And so it really is connecting nicely with a question Dawn put in there about pushing this, this notion of economic driver, and it in contrast, food as an economic driver versus food as a human right, right? And I don't think that we really define access to food as a core human right. When we start talking about justice and equity and the allocation of resources, the repurposing of land, particularly land within the urban core. What do we think about this economic driver lens of food versus food as a human right, food as a justice issue? What do we think?
No, I don't think there's any tension between that. I think that it can be at the same time a fundamental right. We can't live without it, but it also there's also a tremendous opportunity. And I see a question in the chat about, can the URA be more proactive in what we're doing? I think the answer is yes. And so we know that we have these federal ARP dollars coming down. And so one of the things that I am working on is how can we as we look at the dollars are already sort of pre-programmed because it was authored by council as to how the dollars have to be used. But I believe that we have some flexibility to leverage those dollars to put us in a position to be more proactive and to think about how can we look at the shortage of the scarcity of space. Is there a way to kind of embed dollars and funding and support into some of our existing corner stores that are already in these neighborhoods, connect them with farmers, make them a distribution network? We have to think outside of the box. The same status quo approaches are not going to work. And so I think that there is an opportunity. We've not been given a whole lot of money around this particular space, but again, we have to work with what we have. We're going to leverage those dollars, call our broader community to action, work together with a lot of the folks on the phone here, and figure out how to be more proactive in the upcoming months.
Yeah, there is a common thread between us in Pennsylvania and Illinois, being, having, such a large agricultural base and such a, sort of driver. So I'm not sure, what kind of things you all are looking at from your side, Representative Harper, if you wanted to jump in there as well.
Sure. So, and especially when we talk about making sure that we're inclusive of all voices and farmers of color in this conversation, I wanted to bring up something that I passed in Illinois, the Farmer Equity Act. When we talk about making sure that we're even making the right decisions as it relates to ARPA funds, right? And I don't know how it is at you guys' State Department of Agriculture, but we literally have not been on the menu, on anybody's minds, or of concern of anybody at our State Department of Agriculture until now. And I'm very happy to say until now, with our new administration and our new department, and because of the laws that I've passed, the Farmer Equity Act being one of them, which basically adopts the federal definition for socially disadvantaged farmers, right? So that includes Black farmers, Latino farmers, Indigenous farmers, women farmers, anyone who has been subjected or has experienced prejudice because of their racial identity. And now making our state agriculture department disseminated specific information to these farmers, do specific outreach to make sure that these types of farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers, are added to boards and are made a part of big decision making when it comes to state agriculture priorities. How about even working with them to coordinate special state programs for farmers of color? And so when we talk about definitely the flow of funding that could come to go towards such an effort, we do have to make sure, again, that we are on the minds and that we are on the agendas of the people who are in control of that flow of funding. And again, in a lot of these places, it's our state departments of agriculture. So I just wanted to bring that up. Another thing that we've done to kind of help to bring incentives to farmers is we passed the Urban Agriculture Zones Act. And basically that was modeled off of something that we were trying to pilot in Chicago. Before I even went to the General Assembly, we were trying to create what are called urban agriculture districts in different neighborhoods across the city, where in these places where there are large tracts of vacant land, incentives are giving to people to help them buy the land. The process is eased. We are creating partnerships between farmers and food practitioners so that they can share equipment and share other resources that are related to keeping their businesses sustainable, in addition to giving reductions to their electricity bill or giving special incentives on their water rates. And so and when you talk definitely from a policy standpoint or from your local standpoint, what can be done to help some of these think about some of the incentives that we can provide. Think about the flow of funding and how it will come down, and making sure that you are on the mind and the menus of those people's making those allocations. And then also bring in some wonderful public-private partnerships as well. Again, we're living in a time where everybody wants to do right. We can't accept just charity in the form that they want to give it. I want to pass out some food boxes here. I want to give out a scholarship here. That's all fine, wonderful, and dandy. But what can you really do to help to build a solid infrastructure for food equity and food justice that will last us from years to come? And I think that that's where we need to be putting our attention right now, policy-wise, on the ground, community-wise, and of course, funding-wise.
Absolutely. Yeah, Tacoma, you were going to jump in there.
Yeah, that's super cool what you're doing, Rep. Harper. I hope we can emulate some of the work y'all doing in Illinois, because certainly those seem like things would be very useful. I do want to just go back to your question about food as a human right versus it as a economic drive, and there's a tension there. I agree with Dr. Walker. I don't necessarily think there's a tension, but I do think if it could be, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like a matter of how more so than a what. But I do think if we accept that food is a right, that could be a fundamental catalyst as far as a worldview that could help be a beacon for folks. Because I mean, there was a question before this one about like Aboriginal groups, and I think, and especially in my area, and I'll share this in the chat. There are local organizations that we've attempted to reach out to just to get more knowledge about like the history of the land that we're on personally, and recognizing like there's stories that are untold and narratives that we haven't been privy to that we feel like are very important to be able to represent when people tour through our space. And I'm saying that to say, Dr. Malik Yakini, in a book that I shared in chapter 12 of that book, talks about kind of this need to reconcile, the initial like theft, and then the fact that people were brought over here or put in a bondage that were here already to work the land and build that value up, and then create what we have now. Like, I mean, that's the catalyst for this whole thing. So I feel like it behooves everybody, if we talk about justice, that administration of law, to consider that. I mean, and what does that look like to collaborate? And I mean, for folks that are familiar with like, notions like the African diaspora, I do think there's some thread lines there that could possibly be entry points into more expansive conversations. Because to my knowledge, just as being, boots on the ground, that's kind of seldomly happened. There tends to be a lot of compartmentalization for various reasons. So I think, that's something that I'm very interested in learning more about. But, I do think there's a lot of opportunities there. And if we don't reconcile that, it kind of, I don't know, I think it doesn't go far enough to, address the valid notion of land back and what that looks like, and how that is connected to, the well-being of Black communities, and how those things could converge and be beneficial. I'm curious to have more conversations around that, and not just those two communities, but I do think, conversation along those lines. But, furthermore, yeah, I think that's something. And, then there's the conversation around, we've been talking a little bit, I mean, Rep. Harper kind of touched on it, hit on like the four main kind of sectors of food, production, processing, distribution, consumption, disposal, like, industrial parks. And what does it look like to have like we right now in Pittsburgh, there's opportunity zones. So people get like tax credits for built in certain areas, and kind of this notion of trickle down, it doesn't work. Like, it doesn't work. And so I just feel like notions of economic development that sprung up in the 70s that were part of like a Southern strategy, I think we have to be very mindful. But I say all that to say, I do think there are a lot of opportunities, and just being able to kind of properly frame the issue so we can engage in Sankofa and not fall victim to,
No,
your traps.
no.
So
I mean, you've gotta be mindful of the past as we're pushing forward. And Samantha put in the chat about looking at ways that the food businesses can scale efficiently to meet demand, and what does that look like, and how do we get involved on a local level? And so I'm sorry, I got to brag about Food 21 and its partnership that we're doing within the historic Hill District, which a lot of people don't realize was a core part of the route of the Underground Railroad back in its day. I know we tend to look at it in terms of food and culture and the like, but it has a really powerful historic significance as well. And so we're putting in there a food accelerator in a development that's been done by one of the longest standing Black real estate developers, Irv Williams. And so it's going to be an amazing facility. So we have this food accelerator where Black entrepreneurs can come in and be able to take their business to scale. But what's unique about that accelerator is the ability of us to network them together. So we tend to think about scale in the wrong way. We think about scale as bigness, as opposed to looking at enterprises being networked together in a collaboration, which allows two things: allows them to go after bigger opportunities, but allows them to achieve a certain size that is more nimble and more resilient over time. And then that accelerator will give them the opportunity to potentially be part of the food hall, which is going to go in Sankofa Square, that is being developed by E Holdings Incorporated. And in addition to that, it's going to have a co-working kitchen, a ghost kitchen, to be able to have flexibility and nimbleness in terms of what those businesses are allowed to be able to do, in addition to a green roof, which is an event center, as well as an education center that will be part of that development. And it would not have been possible without substantial support from the URA. And so that piece, which is one of the entire portfolio of Food 21, is an example of how we have everything that we need right here. The question is, to what extent will we cross boundaries? To what extent will we recognize history? Tacoma, you're absolutely right about understanding the mistakes of the past so that they don't get replicated again in the present. But how do we leverage the assets that we have, both money as well as talent, as well as land, to be able to move forward? And so I'm really excited about this. This is going to happen. We're in the implementation stages for this to be live in early in 2022. And just really thank you to both E Holdings and Irv Williams and Dr. Walker and our friends at the URA for helping us to take this thing, which was an idea, and make it a reality, showing we have the assets right here.
That's right.
But do we have the will?
That's
That's the issue. We have the assets. There's no doubt in all of the data that we've seen in Food 21, we have the assets here. Do we have the will?
So if I could just, because I love the way that you captured that. I think you summed it up so beautifully. And so when we're talking about the tension of an economic driver versus food being a fundamental right, I want to lift up the work of Food 21 and Irv Williams, because what Irv is doing is he's driving the economy in the Hill District with the development of the Sankofa Square. That is what he is doing. However, by bringing the right partners to the table, he is also saying that we are not going to let capitalistic interests override the need to provide this community with access to fresh food, to give them an opportunity to participate in this economic opportunity. And then pairing Catapult, which is another URA sponsored initiative, which is the work of Tammy Thompson at Catapult Pittsburgh, pairing all of those things together. Now we have a capital stack, not only a monetary capital stack, but a skills capital stack. When you talked about political will, you have that political will there to get that project done. So my argument is that where the tension exists exists between the two, that is where the public sector has to show up with a boatload of subsidy to make these things happen, which is the work that we're doing along Center Avenue. That work is, being, partly subsidized by the city of Pittsburgh and by the Urban Redevelopment Authority. And IRV is assuming the risk as a private developer to take on an underperforming asset and make it do what people will tell us cannot be done. This cannot be done in markets like the Hill District, and we're going to prove people wrong. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm so excited about that project and how it's becoming a model for how we can reframe that tension that exists between being an economic driver and also meeting basic necessities and treating people like human beings in the neighborhood that they live in.
And I got to add, because we brought up the educational piece. So one of the things that we're doing as a project with some students is writing a case study about exactly what's happening so that we can, I think one of the things that the education piece requires is our ability to tell the right story, right? And to own an authentic story. I'm going back to Godfrey, some of the stuff that you talked about, true connections, true impact, true knowledge. And if we don't tell the story correctly, we won't get true knowledge out there.
That's right.
But we got to own that story. So I want to make sure as an educator that we don't lose that piece.
And it's all happening on publicly owned land. So now part of that story is what happens when this is land that is owned by the URA. And when I say owned by the URA, that means the people of the Hill District own it, not the URA as an institution. It's an escrow with us until the community has informed us as to what they want to happen with it. And that is the way that we've got to think about it.
Yep. And it goes back to something I think somebody said earlier about smart growth. Right? About smart growth. And I would say that smart growth is by definition inclusive growth. Right? Tacoma, did I see your hand up again?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I feel like it's maybe a conceptual framing. We recognize like there's all these different moving pieces in the food sector. Like I'm thinking about the labor piece. So as long as kind of labor is commodified in the same way, field peas are or cover crops or whatever, like, compost, any soil amendment. I think that's a piece here too, but also just like this idea of like a feedback loop and kind of if food insecurity arises from people's inability to purchase fresh produce, and that's like exacerbated by the lack of proximity, right? Like there's still like, where's the money coming from? I can't stack nothing if I don't have nothing to save. Like, so I just feel like, are we then talking about labor unions? So back to my point about co-ops, like this kind of, if we kind of view it in that way, I think we can kind of harness the assets there, but also think carefully about how they relate to each other and can amplify each other without, all right, we have this retail space and there's 3 full-time positions and 7 part-time ones paying $15 an hour during a period of crazy inflation, and you can't even afford to hold down your crib, might have to work an extra job or do something else illicit, to be honest. And so I feel like that's a piece of this that's often obscured, like, you know what I mean? I think, so I don't know. I just think like that's an element. But to your question, like what could help, I think like, and I think there's a lot being done right now from what I hear that I'm excited about, but like this idea of like a feedback loop, because then it's like the region, right? So I reference Homewood and what it would take to provide fresh produce to them. The Hills probably has more residents. I'm not actually sure on the numbers, but it's the same situation in a sense if we're still talking about scale and volume and how to have enough supply to meet the demand, right? But furthermore, I think this notion of like the public funding and being subsidized is super critical because a lot of S&P 500 companies are subsidized, right? Like the boom and bust cycle is part of business models. Like, so I just think like if they're able to get money that's being taken and garnished from our checks, like that should be able to be funneled into things like this that actually like keep people alive. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I don't know, I think it's encouraging to hear that, but I do think to be like double down on that. And I think, try to have it where, edible schoolyard educators can receive funding from the county. Like, I do think there's the scale that's required necessitates government because government's being used regardless. You know what I mean? Like to promote regulation that actually benefit people's lives or to promote regulation that benefit the, endeavor to maximize profits at the expense of the well-being of the community. right? So I think like, what are the metrics that gauge that beyond just like, you know, the typical ones, liquidity, cash flow, margin, like growth. And what is growth? Like, how are we defining growth? Is it just simply like our market cap, like, you know what I mean? I'm not saying like like the traditional economic metrics, but like, how can we couple those with like human well-being metrics and like what's required to have a standard of living where you can make a living farming, or, you know, I don't know. So these are just some of the questions.
Well, Tacoma, I want to go back to something that you said earlier, because I actually think one of your earlier comments kind of gets at the question you just raised. And it's that we have to understand that there are three legs to sustainability at all time: economic, environmental, and what you said earlier in one of the other questions, social sustainability. And so one of the things that it mandates for all of us who do this work is to constantly talk about the balancing of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And from that leg of social sustainability are all the metrics about health and well-being and access and the removal of barriers and disparities. That, if you look at how we define and measure social sustainability, and you're right, Dr. Walker, all the ESG and social determinants and benchmark, it's all in there. But the problem we have is that we talk about economic sustainability and environmental sustainability, and we do not understand that there are three legs to that. And so you cannot disentangle them. They are inextricably linked. And so if you want to talk about environmental sustainability, then you gotta also talk about social sustainability, because issues of waste, environmental contamination have an impact on people and health and outcomes. You can't disentangle them. And so when you mentioned social sustainability earlier in the conversation, I was doing a little tap dance with my feet up underneath the table, because it's one of those things that we need to have. As much as we talk about environmental sustainability, it always needs to be those three. And you have to have resources and efforts devoted across all three. And if we didn't learn that before, we better have learned that from the pandemic, because that's what it told us. You can treat these things like they're separate, but you get a pandemic, and again, the food bank knows this better than anybody, right? I was looking at those long lines during the pandemic of coming up for services, and you weren't seeing people on bikes. You were seeing, you saw some BMWs, you saw some nice looking car. You know, it cut across all boundaries when all of a sudden the entire infrastructure was disrupted because of the pandemic. So we might want to think about them as separate, but they're not. And so social sustainability gives us all of those metrics, but we have got to constantly demand that be upfront in how we're thinking about it. What do you think, Godfrey? You got this look like you got five things you want to say, and you're just not sure which one's coming first.
I know I'm learning from you, so that, I mean, I'm writing that down, the three legs. So that's where thanks for that, because that really put it in a lot of perspective for me. But I mean, I'm glad that you brought up the pandemic, and I know we're getting close to the end of this journey here. But if we look at where we started off with these sessions, the first original session was talking about what did we learn from the pandemic? What was that? So this is the last of these series, right? So just going kind of full circle, just looking at what structural changes have been made. Are we making progress, or have we learned from the pandemic, knowing that there are communities that were already in, we're talking about the social sustainability, that were already in peril, but then doubled down on that based on the pandemic. What have we learned, and where are we going with that? That's a thought.
Yeah, what do we think? That's a really good sort of question to get us to sort of push forward to plan the next series of these. You're not done with us yet. So what do we think about that? What are things that we learned? What are things that we adjusted to that we need to keep? That's another thing. We did some creative entrepreneurship during that pandemic. I was watching that. I was like, y'all were getting food, and it was all kind of stuff going on. Woo! I don't know. What do you think?
There's an opportunity to convert survival mode into an actual opportunity to thrive. I think that the pandemic in a lot of ways gave us a reset. We always talked about what does it mean to thrive? What does it mean to thrive? I don't think we could fully define that until we were in survival mode. And so I think that's the actual opportunity in front of us as we hit the reset button. I am not interested in the new normal. I'm not interested. Things were not normal before the pandemic.
Come
So
on now.
we have an opportunity to do a complete paradigm shift. I said the URA did some soul searching. I'm sure everybody on this call had to do some soul searching around what matters. We're looking at the Great Resignation. People are leaving jobs and lots of money, or people are leaving jobs and they don't have any money because their priorities have shifted, and they're going to invest their time and their energy on doing what matters and what keeps them tethered to this planet in a way that keeps them sane, healthy, and whole. And so we all have that opportunity in front of us to do that. And I think that we need to seize it. And we are so eager to get back to how things were. I am not, because this is an opportunity to have things be as though they are supposed to be. And it's going to take each and every one of us, regardless of, political, ideology, what our collective belief systems have to come together and pull together. And what greater unifier than food?
It's right. The thing that's essential. I like what you said. It's not the new normal, because what was happening before wasn't normal. I like that. Tacoma, what do you think?
I think some of the conversations I was privy to when the pandemic initially occurred, concerns about like supply chain failures and things of that nature, did spark interesting talks around like what it means to have a more resilient food system. And I think as we continue forward, it's going to increasingly be necessary. I mean, to Dr. Walker's point, people are kind of recalibrating what does it mean to have a meaningful life, to live a meaningful life. And I feel like for a long time, you kind of sold this notion of like what it means to, we all kind of aspire generically to like a middle-class lifestyle. I feel like without saying, going too deep into that, I don't necessarily know that should be the end all be all for like every person who exists. Like, and I think that plays into like companies more so than like our actual aspirations to like live a meaningful life. So I feel, the more conversation that can be had, the more exposure to like what it could look like, and kind of creative ways people have gone about doing it. I think a lot of that kind of sprung up. There's an initiative I think about in Atlanta, Georgia, where a Black woman and 19 other families bought some land, I want to say like 70 acres or something like that, and decided to, this is what we're doing, like creating a commune. And I feel like I really respected that, because a lot of times people kind of harp and don't make those moves, those power moves. So I feel like, if you prioritize your well-being, your happiness, and, a lifestyle, and try to back map ways I can support that, that seems like a more deliberate approach that would have better results versus just like following these generic paths that have, 1, 2, 3 out of 10 of us are going to ever be able to like take advantage of. So back to Godfrey's point about like I think about like inspiring or trying to, convey what younger people could do in this field. I do a lot of work on just like, trying to dig at the heart of what they're curious about, what they're passionate about, because that's what's going to have to carry you. Because there's a lot of precarity, like a lot of uncertainty. And I feel like, being able to kind of take control of that by divesting from, which was something that's happening now, like people divesting from kind of the normal in different ways, whether it's resonating or finding different ways to sustain themselves outside of what's been traditionally expected. So,
how's that been working for us, right? What's that, doing the same thing over again?
That's insanity. That's insanity. I mean, and also like the same thinking that created the problem can't solve it. So I feel like, we're at a space where, I think there's, as any investor will tell you, there's opportunity in crisis. I think to Dr. Walker's point, like, no, we're not going back to the new normal. Like we going this way. Like, you know what I'm saying? I feel like
new frontier.
I do think there's something that can be like an umbrella to that. Like, so there will obviously everyone's never going to agree on like everything. So I think what are those fundamental things we can all agree on, whether that's like acknowledging like, hey, if you're outside of like the top 5% income bracket, you're probably being exploited to some degree and or being leveraged in this socioeconomic strata where, you know, the super majority of Black people who make below 30,000 or trying to aspire to be middle-class people. The middle-class people are trying to hold on what they have and or aspire to be like the wealthy. And like, I don't know, I think that just has to be broken. Like that kind of, those sentiments and notions have to be augmented with new examples of what people are doing to make a life for themselves and find meaning. Because I think that'll kind of give people the confidence to venture out on their own. You know what I'm saying? So, because not everyone's as bold
Yes.
like that. So.
Absolutely. Representative Harper.
Yes, I'm so into the conversation. What was the final question? What was the question?
I think we let it off by those things that happen in that old normal that we don't want to stick in the new normal, but some stuff that maybe we learned, or some stuff that the light of the disruption really, and you know, and one of those things I think that's right down in your lane is how much policy acts as a barrier, right?
Oh, yes.
And when we needed to move quicker, we had to do some extraordinary things on the policy side to make that happen, right?
Yes, we did. When COVID hit, and it's just so funny, besides agriculture, which is the reason why I got on the agriculture committee, there's not another committee or a lawmaking entity in the House that's related to food. And so when COVID hit, yeah, I know, right? You think, and even the agriculture committee, as a younger legislator, we would never talk about food. It was always about guns. It was always about hunting. It was all about some regulatory, issue, some small regulatory technical change that the department has to make. It's not really focused around making sure that people were fed. And so I'd like to say that that's kind of been a change since the pandemic. We started off actually creating a new committee called Food Accessibility to own in right on that, right? When I speak sometimes, I use a statistic that if there were to be a natural disaster, oh my God, but COVID came, if there were to be a natural disaster, the state of Illinois only has about 3 days worth of food supply, right? So if anything were to happen, we could only survive in Illinois for 3 days. And that goes,
oh my gosh,
talking about really localizing your food share, really becoming food depending on your own, or and really making sure that we are taken care of anytime that there is a natural disaster. But just going back to the original point, it put more of a focus, the pandemic brought people back to food. It brought people back to the land. It brought back people to thinking about their health, right? I'm from a community which was devastatingly hit by COVID deaths and transmission rates, simply because I explained before, we're already dying at an alarming rate from preventable diet-related diseases. I knew it before. I knew it in the food industry, and preaching about food deserts, but until COVID, it really is now sinking in for folks. I can say that here in the state of Illinois, in the city of Chicago, it was not a big thing. It was like, oh, you people live in food deserts. Oh, but you're in the city of Chicago. We don't see the connection. We don't see how that helps us, how that hurts us. And so there was a question that was put in the chat. Yes, I was laughed at in my first years coming down to the General Assembly, just trying to get a definition of what a food desert was, recognizing that there are people who don't live in proximity to healthy food and vegetables. And so, yes, now we do need to grow our own food. And yes, now we do need some benefits, some help, some resources, some land, some dirt, some fencing to help us do that. And now how can we go beyond that and really take our own healthy food system into our own hands? I think that what COVID has done, it's really taken this knowledge that we knew within the food advocacy, urban farming space, and now broaden that to more people, right? So you see even people who weren't interested now going out and getting land in rural areas, trying to learn how to be now closer to nature, trying to learn how to even garden in their backyards. And so I'm happy that, you know, there's this newfound focus. I hope it isn't a trending thing. I hope it is something that we can stick to, but also, again, take advantage of what I would say, this newfound energy from some of the private industry to help to make some real investments that will lead to some true change in these communities, in whichever way that we feel like it looks like, right? In whatever way that is good for your community, your local municipality, your state. We need to figure out what that looks like for us and then go after it.
You know, you know, we have to come back in another 6-8 months and do this again, because it's just been an amazing conversation. I can't even begin to summarize this. So I'm gonna take the coward's approach out and make Godfrey do it to be able to wrap up for us, because there's just so much here. And so, yeah, so let you talk, and then Godfrey, can you sort of do some sort of final comments, because there's a lot here.
To Juan Lacey's point, I don't agree with your point. I do get that there's a lot of conversation around this, but I feel like if the solution you're proposing is that we need more finance capital, where's that capital coming from? And if we recognize like a lot of development has to go to a bank, commercial bank, I don't see how your solution gets us out of this. Yeah, we could get infrastructure, but, and I'm not totally pushing back, because I see what you're saying. Like, we can't rely on nonprofits, because nonprofits rely on foundations. Foundations are created by for-profit companies avoiding taxes. So with that, I don't necessarily think the nonprofit industrial complex is the, say, you know, magic bullet per se, but to say like commercial banks are, seems like there's a level of like dissonance or cognitive dissonance somewhere. Like there's a disconnect there. Like, so I don't know. So I put in the chat like examples of public banks, and maybe that's something that could be used to create lending terms that acknowledge like the nature of that investment or investment opportunity that is a little more flexible and amenable to the types of things that are really the government's job. You know what I'm saying? So.
No, thank you. And thank all of you. Godfrey, I'm gonna turn it over to you for final comments. I really do appreciate everybody for being part of this, and just know that Food 21 is going to be in this space for a long time, looking at multi-sector, multi-level, and inclusive solutions. And so, Godfrey, man, I'm handing it to you for some words of wisdom.
What can I take from all these notes that I've received? And it was great. And I've actually learned a lot as well. I mean, just thinking of this as a whole entire system and different facets of this entire process. We are all connected, no matter what department or what organization we're representing, what we do in our daily lives. That's connected in this process. One of the things I'm going to go back to what Tacumba talked about was, where is that group that gets together that has that interconnected conversation, because something is not working, and then to have these continued conversations such as this can drive a lot of the need into action. And I believe that's where it starts. Representative Harper listed a whole litany of programs and policies that I got to go back and I got to re-listen to that. So waiting for the recording. Dr. Walker really helped us identify, the fact that this is not something that just is a result of current times, but these are things that are consistently over time impacted individuals individually, and that education and it's our part right now to continue that for the future generations, to continue this effort. So a lot that was put together. I'm gonna go back to Adam to close this out. I probably didn't do the roundup justice, but I'm overwhelmed. I'm going to listen back at the recording. I hope everyone else does too. So thank you very much.
We all got some homework to do, don't we?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much for sharing your perspective today. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was an incredible conversation. Like I said, we'll be sending out the recording of this session hopefully next week. All previous sessions can be found at the link I shared in the chat. And with that, it's exactly 1:30. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.